when things get really busy and there's a lot on our plates, it can be difficult to determine which part of those pieces on our plate we're experiencing.
That's your day. Like, you're doing all this stuff. You're busy working. You're busy taking care of kids. You're busy doing all this stuff. And it's like you're feeling anxious, all these feelings. And like that moment of like no distractions, breathing, it's like putting the bottle still and allowing the sediment to sink to the bottom. Welcome back.
We're back. And
As usual,
per usual,
if it's not broken,
don't fix it. I've got classic root beer this morning.
Yep, that's right. You and your A&W nostalgia. Well, it was a cream soda. That was a cream soda.
It was cream soda, but the root beer.
Which, by the way, I passed by an A&W this past Friday.
Yes, you sent me a
picture. Yeah. I was
it.
driving. I was at a stoplight, but I was like, I gotta take this for Dale.
Thank you for doing that, by the way.
It's like an hour away from where we are. So if you ever want to hit it up,
probably need to.
We should go get some cheese curds.
Probably necessary.
Chris Apple, you guys want to get yourself some lollipop? Go ahead, click on the link, get a discount.
Yep.
So
15% off. So
that's right.
It's worth it. Mm-hmm. Brings it down a little bit. So
yeah. So Dale, today is a special episode.
It is,
because for the first time we are going to be responding to some wonderful questions that came in. So thank you all who saw the poll that Dale sent out on his Facebook and the poll that I posted, and filled out your questions and your feedback on the podcast. So if you ever want to leave questions and feedback, we're also going to put a link down here. So it should be there in the show notes. And whenever you have a question, whenever you have a piece of feedback, go ahead and submit it. And we'll try to do this more than once, I feel like.
Yeah, no, it was good. So we had a good turnout for this. Also, I think it's worth saying we won't be able to get to all of the questions. So there were some really good pieces and some questions that were like required more time than just what we're able to provide for something in brevity. Mm-hmm. And so some of those, there was a large response from a few that was like, hey, like we'd like to hear about your stories and how you got to where you're at. And worthwhile, right? Might be interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, no, you have an interesting story, Dale. So
hey,
I want to hear it.
I want to hear the more of the Kenyan stories here. So I think that's valuable.
Yeah. Possibly a future episode.
Yes. And so those did not fall on deaf ears. We will be addressing more of those things. So just worth noting. And there were some other pieces. Again, if you didn't hear your question addressed here today, know that it's on the way.
Yeah, for sure.
But
all good questions.
Yes. So the first one we wanted to look at really quick, which is, I think, relevant just in terms of today's society. So there was a question asked on, someone had asked the question of hearing a lot of advertisements for BetterHelp and other online therapy services. What is your opinion of these platforms? What are the pros and cons of in-person versus online therapy?
The pros and cons of in-person versus online therapy. Okay, let's start with the BetterHelp one.
Okay.
Right. So again, there's more than just BetterHelp out there. So there's Talkspace, there's BetterHelp, there's a whole bunch of these big brand therapy platforms that is becoming a big deal. Like a lot of therapists are looking at the industry and seeing a shift towards these big brands where, basically the therapist signs on to the platform and then you go and BetterHelp sorts it all out and they match you with a therapist.
It's like online dating.
Yeah, it's basically, exactly. Now, we're going to share our thoughts here, but there's lots to be, like, if you go on like Reddit, just go on the internet, there's lots to be said about people's experiences with BetterHelp. Some positive, some negative, as usual. I personally haven't used the platforms for my own therapy. Do you have any immediate thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think this, like anything else, I want to say that I don't want to shoot down the notion of using the platforms themselves. I think it's perfectly legitimate for someone to well, let me back up. I think there's good therapists on all the platforms. I think you can find good therapy still. I think still, as we kind of talked about before in previous episodes, I think probably the most important thing is, hey, like, are you going to be able to hold yourself accountable and allow the therapist to hold you accountable in a way that's helpful and productive for what you are trying to address in the space of therapy, i.e., is it actually going to help you? And I think usually we could even surmise that to a small space of like, do you feel comfortable with a therapist that you're talking to? And if you don't, at what point do you stop and why? And if you notice yourself regressing in a certain way that you identified, okay, I wanted to alter this or be able to do more of this or process this, when did that change? How did it change? Can you be able to address it in this context? That being said, I will say that personally, I have not used those platforms. I would say that the reason that I haven't done that is largely because I have wanted typically, and right, wrong, good, or bad, I think I had viewed these platforms in a way to essentially cater to less specified needs, or rather
Mm,
less developed areas. So perhaps like
like lower acuity.
lower acuity, right?
Hmm.
Well,
Or
I don't know, like
uh,
to be perfectly frank, I judged them. And so I wasn't sure that I would find a therapist as competent on those platforms.
mm,
I don't, and I want to be clear here.
yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think you still can find competent people on those platforms. I'm sure that you can. Personally, though, like in the past, like one, I also wanted in person. I wanted to be able to sit down and talk to people or talk to someone who I was working with. Now, let's say during the COVID years, for example, like when that wasn't possible or as accessible, I I wanted to feel as though there was a high degree of knowledge and awareness around what I was dealing with. And I didn't feel that I could find that on BetterHelp or a service like that.
Mm,
So for that reason, that's why I avoided it.
yeah.
That's just a personal take.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah. And I think I get what you're saying too about, with these big companies and services, there's always the vulnerability of scale, the issues of scale, right? It's like you scale it and it's more so like, is the quality still being maintained, even though this seems like a big service? Like, where's the quality and this specificity, like you said, for my issue? And I think I just, I like that it's accessible.
Mhm.
And if you haven't had therapy before, maybe it's a good place to start, right? Like I'd say go back to the previous episode on how to find a therapist and be mindful of the criteria in which you evaluate the therapist that you might end up being matched with, and be truthful about whether it's the right fit for you. Because like you said, you might end up finding a good therapist on there.
Yeah.
But just know that these companies are trying to scale, trying to grow. They have investors, they need a return on investment.
Mhm.
And that sometimes can trickle down to how they pay their therapists, how they try to get as many customers in the door. And so the question is the quality of service maintained with all those incentives? Ask yourself that question. Like, be mindful of that question. And when you're receiving
Mhm.
the service from them.
Yeah. I mean, as far as just online therapy, like telehealth versus in person, I think there's been enough research and evidence to suggest that like telehealth therapy can be extremely effective
Yeah.
and it can be extremely beneficial still. And even again, we talked about this guy briefly, Irving Yalom, did like a plug for online therapy years back, like saying, I can see that basically saying that he could see the benefit in this space. And I don't know if that is still
Like,
floating
he was
around there.
advocating for online
Yeah, he
therapy?
was supporting the notion. It
Okay.
wasn't necessarily saying that thought it was better than
Okay.
he was just saying, hey, this is still relevant.
Mhm.
Now, I think I think again, to your point, it's really important to evaluate the quality of what you're getting. I think inherently as people, if I know that I'm going like just even as a therapist, if I know I'm going to work for a big box corporation, my I would argue my level of responsibility may decrease easier than if I say, okay, I am responsible to my own entity here, right? This is my name here. Now, arguably, again, it's still your name when you work for a big box corporation or a larger piece here. And I would say that the appeal that those companies try to make for therapists like yourself and myself is that, hey, you can be your own boss. We'll just take care of the headache.
Mhm.
But it's way more than that. And then I would argue too that, again, like as far as, and this is neither here nor there, but as far as income is concerned, it's way less than
Yeah,
what you can be making independently.
for sure.
With that in mind, I think because of that, inherently you risk then someone not taking their work as seriously.
Because it's like you need numbers. You need numbers realistically as a therapist
Yes.
to make your ends meet. And so it's like I'm seeing X amount of clients per day. It's like, how is the quality of my service being impacted by all these numbers of clients that I'm seeing?
Yeah. And so, and one perhaps could make the argument that, oh, well, independently, wouldn't you have the same thing? And I would say that it's different only because you are aware intimately of where the buck stops for you and you are beholden to you. Right. And so you get to be the one to determine at which point you will allow yourself to put more effort into a certain case or to focus on numbers or not.
Hmm.
Whereas in other scenarios, no, it's automatically imposed here. And granted, to a certain degree, you may not be able to escape some of that, but I would argue that the smaller scale operation things are, the more freedom you have inherently.
Hmm.
And I would want to work with someone that feels as though they have a lot of freedom in what they do
Hmm. Yeah.
because that means they're going in I believe that means they're going to be more present with me in what I'm doing or going through.
Mm. I like that. Yeah. And going back to the online versus telehealth versus in person,
Mm,
like half of my current caseload is online, probably more than that. And I personally, I like it from the therapist perspective. I like the
sure.
balance
Yeah.
of that. Again, like the research shows it's effective. I don't see a big difference between the work I do with online clients. Maybe I can't write on the whiteboard as much as I got I got that from you, Dale.
Yeah.
Dale likes writing on the
I like
whiteboard.
whiteboards.
Yeah, it's fun, and my clients actually enjoy it. It's like, hey, this is cool. But I would say personally, I don't enjoy online with kids.
Sure.
Yeah, so if
Well, and I would say that certain cases, like if I'm dealing with people that have experienced any type of trauma or a trauma history, and I'm talking like whether it was accidents, death, and high risk scenarios, I prefer to work with them in person, at least initially,
yeah,
because I would argue as well that there are certain things that are going to function way better in person. Like if we're doing things like exposure response prevention, if we're doing even in certain realms like EMDR. Now, again, like they have different methods now for EMDR to do them online. And that started coming out a few years back. I personally, if I was going to do EMDR again, I don't practice that as much anymore, but that's time for another episode.
hmm,
If I was going to, though, I would prefer to do that in person.
mm, makes sense. Right. Cool.
And guys, just EMDR is a
Yeah.
specific method for trauma in most cases. It can be
Yeah.
utilized for other purposes, but typically m- again, personal opinion, most effective in person.
Mm, yeah. Right. Sweet. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Next
Yeah. All
question.
right. Next question. All right. So what do we got here? Let me find it. Wrote it down on
Or
my whiteboard.
yeah, we have a
Oh,
whiteboard over here.
yeah. Okay. So
Hmm. You want me to read it over here, or
I think I'm gonna pull it up here. Okay.
nice?
So this question was directed in turn. It sounds like this person perhaps is dealing with a certain level of anxiety or difficulty being able to check in with emotional regulation. So the question was, how can someone regularly check in with themselves, their body? Example, if they feel really anxious, how to bring it back down. Or if they can't figure out what it is they're feeling, causing them to feel stuck, how can they help themselves?
Hmm.
Good
Hmm.
question.
Yeah. How do you understand the question?
So the way that I interpret this question is perhaps from a really basic level. And again, if you wrote this question and you're hearing this and you want to correct or
And
send
you
feedback,
butchered
that's
it.
totally fine.
Yeah.
But how I'm interpreting this question is, what do I do when I feel stuck and I feel anxious? Right.
Yeah.
Point blank. Or rather,
Yeah.
I'm having trouble identifying my emotions to know what I feel like. Perhaps I don't like I'm in this space right now. I'm not sure if I feel happy or sad, but I'm told I'm supposed to try to identify emotions, right?
Mm.
That's how so that may be drawn out a little bit.
Oh, okay. So like that, like if once I've identified the emotions, or even
So it
before that.
sounds like this person's having trouble even identifying what their emotions are, like what they feel. They're like,
Mm.
how how do I do this, right? Because it sounds like what they're referring to, and again, if you're listening, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what they're referring to is how do I check in with myself to determine,
Mm.
well, I don't know what I feel.
Yeah. Right.
And I think I can resonate with this to a degree in certain scenarios to where when things get really busy and there's a lot on our plates, it can be difficult to determine which part of those pieces on our plate we're experiencing. And so
Mm.
the only thing that tends to be
So,
experienced is feeling overwhelmed
yeah,
perhaps,
and
but we
anxious. Yeah.
exactly. And so we might be able to identify that, but we don't actually know why perhaps.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I totally resonate with that. Is that full schedule, that full plate, and it's almost it is that constant go 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 on mode where it's like your brain and your mind is moving at a faster pace than 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 you can keep up with, and then like it's like all of a sudden it's like, ugh, what
Yeah.
do I do?
I'd say too, it's like especially if there's been a history for people to try, like any person that's gone through any type of difficulty or challenge in life, whether it was trauma or whether it was difficulty in interpersonal things, relationships. I think when those things happen, things can get thrown off kilter and it can be difficult to then kind of find your center, especially if things in your world
Mhm.
effectively, right? Say whether it was via a relationship, but things like how you characterize your world and your life day to day, if
Mhm.
that changes drastically or one of those elements change drastically,
Mhm.
then I think that can throw off how we experience ourselves day to day. So, getting back to this question, how can someone regularly check in with themselves? How to bring it back down and figure out what they're feeling, right? So, how to identify different parts of that plate? I'm going to list, let's say, several things that I do that I
Yeah.
find helpful.
Yeah, I'll do that as well. Go ahead.
Okay, so one thing I think first and foremost, I think it's really important to eliminate distraction if the mission is to do this. So, for example, if we're saying, all right, well, I need to bring myself down. I want to be able to, be able to identify some things. First, I'm going to eliminate distraction.
Phone,
Phone, right?
big one.
Phone, TV,
Mm.
right? Remove myself from distraction if possible. Second, I need to breathe. You could argue that the breathing comes first, but sometimes we have to remind ourselves to do that,
Mhm.
which is why I say eliminate the distraction so that you can then exhale.
Mm.
And a note about breathing, we could also say more about this, but I would say inherently it's going to be more functional for you first to check in. All right, like when the language in therapy is used, check in with your body, feel your body. Like largely, that I would say that's actually a very pragmatic thing to do, right? So if I notice, say, like right now, like any type of tension in my shoulders, like just like if I can allow myself just to think about, all right, like is my body sore anywhere, right? So for
Mhm.
men, a better descriptor might be to ask, like, all right, is there any soreness or tightness? Are you tight? Right? Then you might be able to more clearly identify it. Sometimes what happens though is if you tell a guy like, all right, check in with your body. What do you notice? It's like, well, I don't notice anything, right? But
Right.
if you ask them, uh, are you tight anywhere? Anything hurt?
Yeah, they're
Anything
like, "Oh, yeah,
uncomfortable?
dude, my
Yeah, no, my shoulders are
shoulders."
super tight,
Yeah.
right? And the same may be true for women as well. Like if you ask them, well, is anything tight? Well, no. Like, how about is there any discomfort? Mm, yeah, maybe there's some discomfort, like, or anything that has existed for a while that you've just gotten used to,
Mm,
right? So I think first and foremost, from a checking in perspective, notice what's tight. Like I can notice sitting here in this chair that okay, my shoulders are kind of tight, so I want to try to relax my shoulders and put my body in a state of mind, a
mhm.
frame to be able to all right, actually relax, right? And then breathing, I think inherently, if you breathe from your diaphragm instead of just short
Short
breaths,
breaths, yep.
right? That's going to calm you down faster than trying to breathe rapid short breaths.
Mm.
And there's a lot
So
of
slow down,
bio
slowing
yeah.
down your breathing.
So I'm a huge fan of combat breathing. Anybody that's worked with me knows this.
Yeah.
And
Could you
and
share?
so combat breathing or square breathing. So we want to breathe in for a count of 3, hold for 4, exhale for 5. I prefer to exhale through the nose only because physiologically what we're trying to do is actually decrease our heart rate. So if you wanted to, you could actually go through this process and you'll notice that your heart rate is decreased, like
Mhm,
slowly dropping.
mm,
Like if you were to go in for 4, hold for 5, exhale for 6, and you can titrate that up.
mm,
And personally, like it works really well for me personally just to be able to bring my level down a notch.
mm.
Now, if things are really elevated and high, like we have to kind of turn on some other pieces to help with that. And this, by all means, is not like a catch all, not medical advice, just something that can be used. Now,
That's what you use,
yeah, something that
right?
I use.
Yeah.
So, with that again, so eliminate distraction, take a breath.
Breath.
Now, this is where I think this part's really important. Put language to something.
Mm,
When I say put language to something, that means either write down what you're experiencing, even if you don't know what you're experiencing, write it down. That could also mean hit something, right? One of the most
yeah.
one of the most cathartic things that I can even ever remember in some of the most challenging points in life was literally taking a stick out into the woods and beating something with it. Not
Yeah.
like a tree, a rock, whatever. Extremely cathartic. Felt great.
Expressed it.
Yeah. I mean, you can see, I'm sure you can look up videos of people like taking a baseball bat to a vehicle or something like that. It would be great. I don't have a vehicle I can take a baseball bat to. But I think that is a form of expression in language because there's a lot of angst. So if that's necessary, okay, do that. Now, that may not be as accessible. Sometimes what we need and what we have access to can determine, all right, well, here's what we can do. So we have to make the best of maybe a not so good situation. So we set aside our space, breathe, allow ourselves to be able to have a moment, quote unquote, identify language that we want to utilize. Okay, so I'm going to write something down. I'm going to speak something. I'm going to physically do something. Now, here's is the next part. I think that gets tricky for most is that if in that process we still feel confused and unsure about what do we feel, what do we do, I think most often what we fail to do after that is we fail to decide.
Mm.
We fail to decide how we want to be, how we want to feel, what we place value on feeling now,
In spite of how we are feeling.
in spite of how we are feeling.
Okay.
So we don't take that next place to then place value on this is how I want to experience this moment. I think one of the things that can help with that immensely is being able to center on the fact that in this moment right now, I'm really grateful for this thing, this
That's a
opportunity.
decision.
That is a decision.
Mhm,
If I can make decisions, those will then impact my choices and my thoughts.
mhm,
What I do next, that will then impact how I feel.
mhm,
So I think this is that in a nutshell. Again, we could
mhm. Yeah,
probably
we
go
could
for hours on
on
different
what
parts
on
of
that.
this,
Oh yeah.
but in a nutshell, I'm I'm going to say, okay, take a moment, take a breath, provide language to something, make a decision.
Mm, yeah. No, that's great because I think a lot of what I do is very similar to that. So one of the things that I try to assess in my life and assess with some of the clients I work with is I ask them like, what break down your schedule, like tell me what how your day goes. Like, what do you do? It's like I get up, okay, go to get ready for work, come back, have meetings, have kids, dinner,
Have kids in that short
no, right,
such a
right. Have kids, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Deal with the kids, feed the kids, all this good stuff. And at the end of the day, you realize there's very little margin. I'm like, where when do you have time for yourself? Right? Even 10 minutes, 15 minutes, just to be still. And the imagery that's helped me is imagining a bottle of water filled with like dirt and soil, right? And just like shake, you shake it, you shake it, you shake it. That's your day. Like you're doing all this stuff. You're busy working, you're busy taking care of kids, you're busy doing all this stuff. And it's like you're feeling anxious, all these feelings. And like that moment of like no distractions, breathing, it's like putting the bottle still in, allowing the sediment to sink to the bottom. And
Oh, that is good imagery. I
and
like
then it
that.
clarifies, right? You've separated the dirt from the water, right? But if you're just constantly shaking the bottle, then it's like that's gonna be super hard for you to understand what's going on within. Like so that's what we were talking about, like the hurry and the rushing from place to place. And so having margin in your day where you can be still, whether you feel anxious or not, just having it on principle, like this is my time to sit and to be still.
I think that's a great point because again, we talked about this in a prior episode, like prior proper planning prevents piss poor performance,
Mm.
right? So intentionally making that effort, like
Yeah.
I call it striking while the iron's cold,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that okay, then we know this is a, and this actually should be another episode, but in terms of self-care, that buzzword, right?
Yes.
Doing things that are good for you,
Yeah.
right? I would say that's a very important point. I also really like your bottle metaphor because the bottle gets a bad rap, really. Like,
Mhm.
because how often have we heard, well, I don't want to bottle my emotions. I think
Mm.
that's really it's really become a very unfunctional way to use a metaphor. I would suggest that bottles were
Yeah.
meant to hold something.
Bottles are meant to hold stuff. Yeah.
They're meant to hold things. What
Yeah.
you don't want to do, you mean, is you don't want to pour your bottle out on the counter or on somebody else
Yes.
or
Where it's
all
not
over the
meant to be
floor.
poured, right? Make a
Exact
mess.
exactly. But it was make no mistake, the bottle was meant to hold
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
how can we create intentional opportunities for the bottle to be able to pour it out in the sink
Yeah.
or outside,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Way more functional, but that bottle was meant to hold something. So,
Yes.
bottling,
To
right?
contain. Mhm.
Yeah, that is the whole point of our internal and external locus of control.
Mm. Right. Exactly. Right. So that margin for me is like super helpful. If I don't have that, that's to me that's the first red flag, first like warning sign that things are not okay, that I'm moving too fast, like I'm not taking time to take stock. And then sometimes, and this is something my wife has taught me, is that sometimes going for a walk, she rides her bike sometimes. That's like the hitting something with a stick in the woods, right? It's just like
The physical language.
physical, yeah, the physical language of like I think it was it Kierkegaard or Churchill who said like walking can solve all your problems. Like, just take a walk, dude. You'd be surprised how many problems are solved
That sounds
simply by
like
taking
something
a walk.
Churchill would say.
Yeah, he's like, dude, walking will solve
Just walk.
everything. Yeah, he's like, there's no problem that hasn't been solved after a walk. And so yeah, so moving your body, and then secondly, like putting language to things. So like one thing that's helped me is the classic tool in therapy, the emotions wheel,
Mm.
right? And just
Tell
using
tell
it
us
as a
what is that?
yeah. So if you go to Google it, it's like this like rainbow wheel filled with all kinds of emotions. So like in the center, there's like the big emotions that we tend to usually label like happy, sad, angry. And then you kind of go outside the circle, and like within sad, they could be depressed, there could be hurt, there could be grief, there could be, and then within those there's more emotions, and so you realize that there's a whole Rolodex of emotions that we as humans experience. And at times, when you're feeling anxious or like overwhelmed, like you can't really discern. And so pull that wheel out, ask yourself, like, hey, what are some of the feelings here that might be going on? And you'll realize it's usually more than one. It doesn't have to be just one. It can be like two or three, right?
7 things can be true at once.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, man, I feel hurt. I feel embarrassed. I feel right. And then you can even before that, you can ask yourself, what happened. So one of the things I journal, and I always ask myself, what happened today? Just free thoughts. I just free flow, free. I just journal whatever comes to mind. Just get my thoughts out on paper.
Freud would be proud.
Yeah, Freud, free association. Yeah. So I just let my thoughts come, and then I'm like, okay, these are the things that's happening. This is what's top of mind. How am I feeling about it? And then from there, there's a whole lot of processing that takes place. So I was like, okay, what's the narrative? What's the story I'm telling myself? Like as a result. But then like again, one of the most important things after that is like, what is the action I need to take? What is the decision I need to make?
Mm.
Yep.
Good things.
Cool.
Good things.
All right.
I think we hit that question.
Mhm.
We'll go on to this next one here. So this next question was asked, with today's society, the current generation's view on therapy or over-therapizing, what would be your recommendation on how to bring up a topic that clients may feel as if they should bring this up in session or be seen for, but they decide not to, or they negate or disregard their concern because society has taught them that they will either become labeled or that it will be minimized due to the topic being overused? Examples including, I'm assuming they mean narcissistic personality disorder, gaslighting,
Mm.
borderline personality disorder, or other self-diagnoses.
Mm.
So that's a large question. Again, I'm going to do my best to try to summarize this. And if the person
right.
listening
Summarize
to
that
this,
question.
if the person listening to this disagrees with how I interpret it, my apologies. It sounds like what they mean though is
Don't mess up, Dale. Don't mess up.
right. It sounds like what they mean here is to say, what do I do if I identify with a certain diagnosis, perhaps that I've been looking into myself, but I'm hesitant to bring up out of concern that it's overused or how I will be seen?
Yeah. Like, oh, of course, right. Of course you self-diagnosed. Right.
Sure.
You watch that video and okay.
Watching too much YouTube.
Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah. Of course you got bipolar.
How to
or
spot a
whatever.
narcissist.
Yeah. So that fear of like, oh man.
Yeah. I think it's relevant to always consider, why do we have diagnoses? What's the purpose of them?
In the first place.
Exactly. I would argue that the purpose of a diagnosis really is only to benefit the client or patient. And the moment that it stops doing that, it's useless. I think that large in part we've forgotten that. And I will be the first to admit that when I first came out of school, as much as I might say that, like my brain was still focused on, all right, like how do I make the differential, right? How do I attach the label so that I can accurately determine what I'm working with?
Right.
And I would say that that's the wrong place to start from, actually. I think the right place or more helpful place to start from is, what is it that they are dealing with? What are the areas that they are desiring to improve on, and what's impacting things the most? So if we're talking about this as it pertains to ourselves, what are we desiring to address that we notice is impacting us negatively? So what are we doing? Why do we feel we're doing that? I.e., like, what are some of the things that come up that perhaps perpetuate this thing? And how much we may not be able to answer all of these questions, but how much can we answer these questions? And then on top of that, so if we have that in mind, what have we tried to do about this before that hasn't worked or has worked?
Mm-hmm.
If we can answer those questions, I think we can get a large pace out of the way.
Mm.
And I think ideally, our job is to help identify those questions and perhaps ask a few different questions in relationship to that and have a different perspective over time on how the interventions are working
Mm.
and what's perhaps happening.
Yeah. So what would you say about the perception that someone is worried maybe if I tell this to my therapist, they'll dismiss me, they'll minimize me, or they'll be like, yeah, you don't have that. Like just
Yeah.
like, will it be taken seriously if I find myself experiencing or relating to symptoms that are being described maybe on a video I watched, an article I read,
Well,
ChatGPT,
sure.
kind of,
I,
self-diagnosis?
I think one thing that's important to remember too is that essentially, and I could be slightly off on the number, but I believe it's somewhere between 30 to 40 symptoms that the DSM is made up of. So the DSM, for those of you that don't know, it's the tool that medical practitioners, therapists utilize to be able to make a diagnosis. That is
Mm.
the
For
yes,
psychological.
for psychological purposes, right?
Yeah.
Now, that book effectively is made up between 30 and 40 different types of symptoms.
Mm.
So think 30 to 40 things,
Mm.
all categorized differently and then placed in different spaces.
Mm. Mm. Mhm.
Now, if we see it in that light, how likely is it that you or I have some of those?
Very likely.
Very likely, actually. And to a degree, this is where this becomes slightly nuanced, because to a degree, if we were to say put everything on a spectrum, everyone would fit that to a degree. Now, what regard and wherein lies that spectrum, that's really what is our job to try to determine, okay,
Right.
what fits the bill.
Mhm.
And I would say that's where it's really pertinent to determine, well, what's impacting our life in this scenario,
Right.
right? So, for
The
example,
functioning.
exactly the level of functioning. And that's where I would say this becomes more relevant now. So, to someone that's concerned about bringing it up with a therapist, it's like, no, I would absolutely encourage them to. And I would also say that more than likely your therapist is probably going to say, yeah, tell me a little bit more about what you're experiencing and how you're experiencing that.
Right. Like hopefully it should deal with that with curiosity instead of judgment.
Sure.
Like, oh
Or
no.
critical judgment, right? Because I'm
Yeah,
gonna,
oh
yeah,
yeah. Sorry.
right.
Yeah. Going
Yeah,
back
yeah.
to a certain episode. Yeah.
So, because again, in reality, if we see it from that lens, then we may be able to take stock to recognize that perhaps, yeah, there's parts of this, right? So, for example, maybe I like things clean, right? I like to clean things.
Mm.
Let's just say, for example, like, okay, I like making sure my office is clean, but not as clean, perhaps, as somebody that deep cleans it and then puts, say, towels all over the sofas and vacuums the
Mm.
walls and ceilings daily
Right.
as soon as they
Does
walk in the
laundry
room,
several times.
washes their hands 15 times a day, tries not to, like, so I think you understand what I'm saying there.
Yeah.
So I may like things clean, but not that clean. Right. And so this is where I think it's worth noting there's scalings to these pieces. And
Mm.
so if we're finding ourselves concerned with that, I think again we have to understand too that, like, or perhaps ask the question, well, what is it we're trying to gain from this diagnosis? Right? Or perhaps identifying this.
Mhm.
What are the things we're trying to be able to prevent or minimize with this in mind? And I think that's a very relevant question, because that might also be a good question for the therapist to ask is, all right, like, yeah, tell me about what we're trying to be able to achieve here. And
Yeah.
what,
What would it mean to you if you were this? If you did have if you did have this diagnosis?
yes. And I would say this is the other part that we want to be sure that we are also considering is that too often, and this is the reason that I don't like diagnoses, too often people identify with that thing as
Mhm.
them.
Mhm. Over identify the
They
diagnosis.
over identify with the diagnoses,
Mhm.
and it becomes too much of their identity that is no longer helpful or functional.
Right.
I saw a really funny, and again, I'm just learning how to use social media, so I guess it was this reel or something where, and maybe this is from a show, maybe others have seen it, but this this person was saying, I guess they were in a classroom and they were like, yeah, unfortunately, I have asymptomatic Tourette's.
Asymptomatic Tourette's. So basically
Yes,
you're saying I have Tourette's without the symptoms of Tourette's?
yes.
That's interesting.
So
That's interesting.
right, but that the person receiving this information was like, oh, okay, and then somebody that they were in a classroom and it was young kids, and so another kid was like, well, yeah, you see, really asymptomatic Tourette's is way worse because they don't, they have to experience all the pain, but there's no evidence that they're experiencing it, so it's really hard.
Got you. Got you. Interesting. Yeah.
Right. But this, I would say that's a classic example of the fact that the problem is not the fact that they have asymptomatic Tourette's. The problem is the fact that they feel that they have a problem,
Yes. Right.
because effectively, what is asymptomatic Tourette's? It's
Yeah.
nothing. It's not a
Right.
thing.
Yeah, that's we could say asymptomatic
At least not,
fill in the blank.
at least not today. Maybe in 20 years it will be.
Yeah.
With that in mind, I would say that it's really important when we consider diagnoses to recognize that, like, for instance, when I say, all right, I have a broken leg or I have a broken arm, I don't say, hi, I'm Dale, I have broken leg
Mm,
or I'm broken arm.
right.
I think there's a reason we don't say that, because I as a person
Mm.
am made up more
Multiple
of multiple
multiple
pieces.
parts.
And I
Yeah.
would argue too that, okay, yes, now we could take this to the extreme of somebody who perhaps is a paraplegic, right? That,
Yeah, like, hey, yeah, I might not be able to come to this restaurant because
well,
it
and
has doesn't have a lift.
they don't have to go, they don't
Yeah.
typically, at least most that I have met, don't typically
Lead with that.
lead with it. Like, don't typically wheel up to you and say, "Hi, I'm a paraplegic."
Mm.
Oh, I can see that. They know that. It's known.
It's known.
They're not actually concerned with that anymore.
Mm.
Right? I would argue that most that find comfort in where they're at in their stage in life and journey
Mhm, mhm.
understand that this is not their identity.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring up a point though
Okay.
that our good friend Frankel.
On this same
So
okay.
on a very similar vein, because
Yeah.
he's basically talking about, and I think this is where we kind of learned this, was over years and years, there was a propensity, and he's talking about this propensity to over identify with things like diagnoses. And he's saying here, for too long a time, for half a century, in fact, psychiatry tried to interpret the human mind merely as a mechanism, and
Mm.
consequently, the therapy of mental disease merely in terms of a technique.
Mm.
I believe this dream has been dreamt out. What now begins to loom on the horizon are not the sketches of a psychologized medicine, but rather those of a humanized psychiatry. A doctor, however, who would still interpret his own role mainly as that of a technician, would confess that he sees in his patient nothing more than a machine instead of seeing the human being behind the disease.
Mm. Wow.
A human being is not one of the things among other things. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining.
Wow.
Man is ultimately self-determining. So he goes even a step further, and actually in a paragraph before, but I'm going to say this after. He says, an incurably psychotic individual may lose his usefulness, but yet retain the dignity of being a human. He's arguing that we are more than just the deficits.
Yes.
This, in my psychiatric credo, or excuse me, he says, this is my psychiatric credo. Without it, I should not think it worthwhile to be a psychiatrist. So if I don't believe people are more than just what they're experiencing, what we've identified, then why am I doing this? For whose sake, he says? Just for the sake of a damaged brain machine which cannot be repaired? If the
Damaged
patient
brain
were not
machine.
definitely more, so if people were not more than just this, euthanasia would be justified.
Wow.
And you're just like, okay.
Yeah, and we're getting deep. We're getting deep there.
So
A lot of implications.
Yes, lots of implications.
Philosophical implications there.
So don't over-identify.
Yeah. And I'd say lead the conversation when you're talking with your therapist. Try to, as much as possible, try to lead with the symptoms, right? As well. Like, of course, bring up what you feel you need to bring up. You should be comfortable, but try to be specific. Like, what is it you're experiencing that is making you lean in this direction? But what you said, like, over identifying why, what's the benefit, what's the gain?
We're ready for the next question.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So this is a good question.
I think will this be our last one for today? Probably. Maybe.
So maybe.
All right.
Maybe it's kind of part and parcel. So actually, I think I left. Yeah. So we'll go with this one. As a therapist, how do you discern when a client needs to be heard and when they need to be pushed or challenged?
This is good.
This is a good question. And
I'm curious, is this like another therapist asking us this? Because it's like,
well, so what do you think?
I'm going to let you in class, right?
I'm going to let you lead with this. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I do, and this is just like as a person, even without being a therapist, like outside of therapy, when I'm dealing with other human beings, other friends, right, is I kind of go by the not the mantra, but like the idea of like, I don't care how much you have to say if I don't know how much you care. Right. And
people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah, exactly. And that also the idea of relational equity. Like, have I built up the relational equity that when I challenge you and when I give you feedback that might be difficult, that might be uncomfortable, you will hear me and you will receive it. Because it's not just me sharing it. It's also me evaluating your ability to receive what I'm about to share with you. And so, one of the things that most therapists will do early on in seeing you is try to build rapport, just like you do in any relationship. It's like, let's build rapport, let's connect, let's connect on a few things. And from there, so again, how do you discern when a client needs to be heard versus when they need to be pushed? Yeah, I'd say I always start with hearing. And then I can move to the, okay, now that you know that I hear you, can I push you so you can hear that? Because I think at the end of the day, me challenging you as a client is you hearing me, right? Why should you hear me if you don't think you're heard by me? So that's why, again, I always start with hearing and then I push. Now, when to discern that is, I'm still trying to come up with my framework for it, but I'm curious to hear what your framework is. But I just wanted to start there.
So I'm gonna give the quintessential therapist answer and say it depends.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like,
right?
I'm trying to figure out what's the
I think in this context it does depend on the relationship. I think in this context it does depend on. I agree with what you said and I like what you said. in terms of relational equity.
Mhm.
I think that you have to have the money in the bank
Mm.
in order to be able to make a withdrawal.
Right.
Now, discerning when they need to be heard and when they need to be pushed or challenged. Sometimes what I will do is I'll ask them, what do you need? Can you identify that? And I may even lead with that to ask the question like, do you want my feedback here? Do you want to be pushed here?
Mhm.
And I think that's a relevant question to ask. And so I would say that how I determine that hopefully is based on the information that I get from that question. And then hopefully is based on the amount of rapport that I feel that exists with the individual to say, all right, like I'm going to push here.
So like it's almost like they give you permission
Yes.
to be challenged, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So I would say that's that one in a nutshell. We
Yeah,
could, we
that's
could
like
definitely go
there's more
for,
to be
there's
yeah,
always,
there's a lot to
sure.
be explored there, yeah.
But I would say, again, depending on relational equity and what they want,
Mm.
right? What they're asking for. So have they asked for this? Have they been open about this? Right. Now, sometimes I think even when they ask for something, perhaps we have to also, there does come to be a slight scenario to where people will ask for things that they don't actually mean. And that's evidenced by the fact of what they continue to do when they ask for something.
Mhm.
So someone may say, I really want to be pushed.
Mm.
But then when we offer the slightest bit of push, there is an inadvertent regression or a defensive mechanism that comes up
Mhm.
that now creates barriers, or rather, that is dismissed very quickly.
Mhm.
Now, if they keep bringing that up to say, no, yeah, I'd like you to push me on this, and then it keeps coming up again, and there's this defensive piece, then I may bring up, well, you say you want this, but then this happens. Tell me about that. Help me understand why that's happening, because I'm not sure how to help now.
Mm. Yeah, that's like your classical motivational
Right,
interviewing,
exactly.
right? Right, because like and that's a lot of clients do experience that is ambivalence,
Sure.
which by the way, my wife putting her under the bus here because she's the English teacher, but this word she thought ambivalence meant I don't care.
Mm,
But ambivalence actually means like your care is divided. Like you want this, but you also want this, like you're on the fence. And a lot of clients do come into therapy and they're ambivalent. Like,
most.
I do want change. I do want to be challenged, but I really also don't want to be challenged. I want to be comfortable.
Sure.
And so I think the therapist's job is asking those questions to help them like assess their motivation. Like just that question you asked there, like, hey, like I hear you say you want this, but this is also happening. Like, tell me about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Last question for
Mm.
today. This is a good question too. In your episodes, you frequently talk about purpose and meaning, that those are higher order concerns than, for example, happiness. What is the relationship between circumstances and meaning? For example, if your sense of purpose in large part from your work, or excuse me, if you get your sense of purpose in large part from your work, but your company goes bankrupt, what do you do next?
Ooh, that's if that's a real situation, I'm sorry that you went through that. That's tough. Um, yeah, that's tough.
What do you think?
Well,
I'm putting you on the spot here.
yeah, man. Well, I think it's it harkens back to some conversations we've had in previous episodes about purpose and meaning, and I think the key part is trying to discern what exactly was that purpose that you were gaining from your work, right? Was it the fact that you could help other people, the fact that you could try new things, like some people like like your work was a sense of like adventure and novelty and things like that. I don't know, there's multiple things that people gain from work, and now it feels like you've lost it. And in many ways there is a loss. Yes, there's that particular experience is gone. But I would challenge the notion that, let's say the reason why you were at that job is to help people, and you really got a sense of purpose from helping people in this way. I would challenge the notion of tying that to that company, because helping people is not, that is now what we talk about values, and we've been talking about values for a while here. Is like that's a value, like being helpful and helping others. That is not tied to a single company. That is not tied to a single circumstance or situation. Now, you might enjoy helping people in that very specific way that maybe that company gave to you. But I would again challenge you to expand your horizons of what is the real value that you were pursuing, or thought was being fulfilled by the company, that actually can be fulfilled regardless of the company you're working for, regardless of the circumstance you're in, because values are very expansive in that way. They're not necessarily limited to a situation or circumstance.
So if their company goes out of business or if they go bankrupt, proverbially, what do you think?
If their company goes out of business,
Yeah, or goes bankrupt rather.
yeah.
What do they do?
What do they do next?
Yes.
Well, first of all, do you need money? Do you
Yeah.
need a job?
Yes. So it sounds like you're
Right?
saying you address the pragmatic, but then you also
Yeah,
lead with value.
exactly. Yeah, because at the end of the day, you need to address your basic needs if you're responsible for family, right? And that's again, that's still value, because it's important for you to take care of your family. That's a value. You value that, and it's also necessary in the moment. So yeah, address the pragmatic needs, but also realize that your purpose is not limited to, or your purpose shouldn't be limited to, the whims and the decisions of other people, right? That your purpose is much more expansive than that. And open up your mind to the reality that there's way more to it than that situation. I'd say start there.
No, I like that.
Yeah.
I
How
think
about you?
I think so. This is I agree with that because I think that framework allows you to be able to be consistent in any scenario
Hmm.
potentially. Now, with that in mind, I'm also highly bent on the notion of freedom
Hmm. Hmm.
and being able to choose your freedom. However, there's an interesting piece that again, I'm gonna bring up this dude again,
Viktor
Frankl,
Frankl,
and
Man's Search for
yeah.
Meaning.
So I'm gonna bring up. So he's saying here that freedom, however, is not the last word.
Okay.
Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. So if we're talking about, like, obviously I'm talking about a value piece here. So for instance, if I was in this person's situation, like, okay, well, I really value freedom, right? But my company went out of business. What do I do here? And so I'm talking like, okay, my top tier is freedom. And so I should go pursue that to the nth degree, right? However, he's saying freedom, however, is not the last word. Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. Freedom is but the negative aspect of the whole phenomenon, whose positive aspect is responsibleness.
Hmm.
In fact, freedom is in danger of degenerating into the mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness.
Yeah. Freedom is preserved by virtue.
Exactly.
I think that was C.S. Lewis.
So and then then Frankel goes on here to say, this is why I recommend the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. I don't think that'll ever happen,
That's so
but
good.
it's wild.
Wait, Victor said that?
Yes,
He said that right
yes,
there?
yes.
That's so
Page
good.
132, Man Search for Meaning.
That's so funny. Yeah.
So Again, and he goes on to say here, there is nothing conceivable which would so condition a man as to leave him without the slightest freedom. Therefore, a residue of freedom, however limited as it may be, is left to man in neurotic and even psychotic cases. Indeed, the innermost core of the patient's personality is not even touched.
Mm.
Right.
So okay, so apply that to this
So in
situation.
this situation,
Yeah.
excuse me. So for example, like I think this, in other words, describes what you're saying, right?
Mm.
If I say, let's maybe twist it a little bit.
Mhm.
If I, for example, maybe the company I'm working for is degenerating,
Mhm.
and I have a high value of freedom, and I just want to be by myself, or I want to go do my own
And
thing
you don't
for
want to
me.
be confined by
But
this
that is
terrible
not
situation.
responsible.
Oh, like I want to quit my job.
Exactly. So there is a certain level to that
Yeah.
that I would argue has to be couched. And I think that's what he's saying here, in that, yes, freedom is direly important to the psyche, right? But insofar as your responsibility to utilize that with responsibility,
Mm.
right? Recognize that you can do anything that it is that you want to do.
Mm.
Anything,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Just because anything is possible doesn't mean that anything is permissible.
Mm.
And where does it line up with your values? Now, I think lastly, one thing I might say towards this person in this question is it's written very eloquently. And to me, it sounds as like when I see questions like this in general, for example, if your sense of purpose, excuse me, if your sense of purpose in large part from your work, but your company goes bankrupt, what do you do next? It sounds as though to some degree, and if you're listening to this, if I'm off base, I apologize, but it sounds like
Mhm.
there may be an answer to this question already that's thought or proposed, right? I don't, and again, if your company went out of business, I apologize greatly. And I think that's terrible.
Mm.
However, I would be curious to know what is desired,
Mm. Like, what
right?
do you want?
What do you want
Right.
exactly?
Mhm.
What do you want to do?
Mm. Yeah.
What is it that you want to do? What is inhibiting you from doing that?
Mhm.
And at a basic premise, well, where do your values lead you? Or rather, where can you follow your values the most effectively?
Mm. Yes.
And I think so this, and to a slight degree here, I think to critique this a little bit more, and lastly, is to say that they're saying those higher order concerns, for example, happiness, what's the relationship between circumstance and meaning? Well, I would argue
Yes.
that circumstance in a large degree is circumstantial, just like an emotion that will come and go.
Yes.
And so it's not something that should be treated as though it's permanent,
Mm.
because that would be misguided.
Yeah. And that's when it's heavily disappointing. When
Yes.
the what we thought was permanent is no longer so,
Yeah.
right? And it's that idea of like I like this something my mentor used to tell me is it's not just the years of experience, but the experience in the years,
Mm,
right? And so it's not just like, oh, this is just a great circumstance. This is just I'm
mm,
really riding this wave,
mm,
right? But what is the meaning and the value we ascribe to each circumstance that we are in, regardless of whether it's naturally like, hey, um, yeah,
yeah. Okay. Well, once again, everyone, thank you so much for the comments and questions. Please continue to ask more. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, go ahead and order some Olipop while you're at it.
for sure. And yeah,
Enjoy
keep
it.
the questions coming. We'll do
And
this again sometime.
absolutely. All right.
All
That's a
right,
wrap.
that's a wrap.